The land of France lay broken in the 15th century, scarred by the endless struggle of the Hundred Years' War. Villages stood half-burned, their timbers blackened by raids that seemed to come with every season. Fields once golden with wheat were left fallow, trampled by horses and armies that marched back and forth without end. Hunger hollowed out the faces of peasants, and the sound of church bells often meant another funeral rather than a celebration. In the small village of Domremy, surrounded by quiet forests and the slow flow of the Meuse River, life was just as fragile as anywhere else. The people there worked the soil, prayed for peace, and waited for news that never seemed to bring hope. It was here, among animals and pastures, that a girl named Jean lived in obscurity, tending sheep and learning the rhythms of rural survival. Nothing in her birth, her family, or her station suggested that her name would ever reach beyond the boundaries of her parish. Yet within this ordinary setting, something extraordinary stirred. Jean began to hear voices that did not belong to the world around her. They came to her not in dreams, but in the light of day, filling her with a sense of urgency and command. To her, they were the words of saints, a divine calling that demanded obedience. The world around her doubted such visions, but within her, the conviction grew stronger with every passing season. These voices carried a message larger than the quiet meadows of Domremy. They spoke of France, of a kingdom torn apart by foreign armies and by its own weakness. They told her that the rightful heir to the throne needed to be crowned, and that the English yoke must be broken. To a poor peasant girl, the idea was unthinkable, yet the voices did not fade. They returned again and again, relentless, until the ordinary boundaries of her life no longer held meaning. Jean walked the fields with a weight heavier than any bundle of firewood or pail of water. Each furrow in the earth, each sound of the wind across the grass seemed to remind her of what she had been told. She felt as though she carried two worlds within her, the world of the village, small and predictable, and the world of destiny, vast and dangerous. The tension between the two grew sharper with time, until silence was no longer possible. Thus began the transformation of a shepherd girl into a figure shaped by belief and necessity. The voices over the fields of Domremy did not merely echo in her mind. They set her feet on a path that would stretch far beyond her village, far beyond a reach of her neighbors' imaginations. The pastures where sheep once grazed became the stage for an invisible command, and the girl who listened was no longer only a daughter of peasants. She had become a vessel for something greater, though she could not yet see how far that burden would carry her.
The decision to leave Domremy was not born of impulse, but of conviction that had ripened with time. Jean knew that remaining in the safety of her village would mean silence, and silence was impossible after the voices had filled her with their command. Her path lay across a land fractured by war, where loyalty shifted like the wind and danger lurked on every road. She was only a peasant girl, untrained in arms, but her faith built a shield stronger than steel. The journey toward Chinon was long and perilous. The countryside was infested with bands of marauders who thrived on the chaos of war, robbing travelers and burning farmsteads. Soldiers without pay often turned to plunder, and the emblem of authority no longer guaranteed safety. Jean traveled disguised in the garb of a man, her figure hidden beneath coarse cloth and armor too large for her frame. It was not the strength of her body, but the intensity of her gaze that unsettled those who looked upon her. Each night on the road tested her endurance. The cold crept into her bones, food was scarce, and sleep came uneasily, broken by the watchfulness required in hostile lands. Yet she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. Those who accompanied her felt an unusual certainty in her presence, as though the hazards of the journey bent themselves before her purpose. Rumors began to spread among villagers and soldiers who caught sight of her. A maiden on a mission from God, a figure too young to bear such gravity, yet impossible to dismiss. When she passed through towns and small castles, she drew attention not for wealth or arms, but for the fire in her demeanor. The sight of a frail girl dressed as a soldier, speaking with confidence about the salvation of France, unsettled the weary hearts of common people. To some, she seemed foolish, to others, a beacon of hope, but to all, she was unforgettable. Her reputation moved ahead of her, carried by whispers and speculation, until her name reached ears that had never seen her face. By the time Jean approached Chinon, where Charles, the Dauphin of France, held his uncertain court, anticipation had already taken root. Courtiers muttered among themselves about the strange maiden, whose faith was said to surpass reason. Some mocked the thought of a peasant girl sent to rescue a kingdom. Others feared what it might mean if her claim was true. When she finally entered the halls of Chinon, the contrast between her and her surroundings could not have been sharper. The stone chambers glimmered with the wealth of nobility, yet into them walked a figure from the fields, clothed in plain armor and carrying only conviction as her weapon. Laughter and disbelief rippled among the courtiers, but beneath the mockery lay unease. For if she truly had been chosen by heaven, their power, their certainties, and even their laughter would one day be silenced.
Spring of 1429 carried with it the weight of a kingdom's fate. Orléans, battered and besieged, stood as the final stronghold of French resistance against the relentless advance of the English. For months, the city had endured hunger, fear, and the thunder of enemy artillery. Wooden palisades and stone walls trembled under the constant bombardment, while the people within counted their days in dwindling loaves of bread and the sound of bells tolling for the dead. Should Orléans fall, the heart of France would be exposed, and the last hope of independence would wither. Into this crucible stepped Joan, the shepherd girl turned visionary, with neither lineage nor military schooling to justify her place on the battlefield. Yet her arrival brought with it a surge of expectation that no weapon could create. Soldiers and townsfolk alike turned their eyes to her banner, a white standard painted with sacred symbols, and felt something stir within them. Where commanders argued and despaired, Joan walked with an unshakable calm, speaking not with strategy, but with conviction that the city would not fall. The English, entrenched in their fortified positions, had already constructed a chain of bastions around Orléans. Each fort stood as a symbol of their tightening grip, and each one reminded the defenders that they were trapped inside a cage of iron and fire. The French forces had grown weary under months of attrition, their courage eroded by defeats and betrayals. Yet with Joan's presence, the atmosphere shifted. She stood among soldiers in battered armor, carrying no sword in her hand, but her very stance turned despair into defiance. As the days unfolded, Joan urged the commanders to strike where hesitation had ruled. Her insistence was not rooted in tactics, but in a certainty that defied logic. Against the better judgment of seasoned captains, the French began to mount assaults on the English bastions. With Joan's banner raised high, men who had once shrunk from the thought of open combat surged forward with renewed vigor. Her presence at the front transformed fear into something resembling faith. On the walls of Orléans, townsfolk gathered to watch the sight of the maiden riding among armored knights, her banner visible even through smoke and dust. To them, it seemed as if heaven itself had chosen to intervene. The English, who had mocked her as a deluded peasant, found themselves unsettled by the ferocity she inspired. They faced not merely soldiers, but men and women who believed they were defending a chosen instrument of God. The battles that followed were brutal and costly. Arrows darkened the sky, cannons roared across the river, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of steel. Joan herself was struck by an arrow during one of the assaults, yet she returned to the field, her resilience igniting those who faltered. Each victory, however small, loosened the noose around the city, and each step forward carried the weight of a legend in the making. After months of despair, the tide shifted. French troops stormed the English positions with a ferocity unseen in years, driving their enemies back from the very walls they had sought to breach. By early May, the siege was broken and the English were forced into retreat. The city that had been on the brink of collapse erupted in jubilation. Bells rang not for the dead, but for deliverance, and the banner of John stood unchallenged over Orleans. The victory was more than military, it was symbolic, a rupture in the long chain of defeats that had crushed the spirit of France. News of the maiden who had lifted the siege spread swiftly across the land and beyond its borders, carried by merchants, priests, and soldiers. Her name traveled faster than any army, stirring hope in allies and unease in enemies. In the spring of 1429, Orleans had been saved, and with it, the fragile heart of a nation began to beat again.
The triumph at Orleans had lifted Charles to the throne he long desired, but gratitude proved fleeting in the gilded halls of power. The ceremony at Reims, where he had been anointed as king, shone with pageantry and sacred ritual, yet beneath the glitter of crowns and candles lay unease. The young monarch owed his coronation to the shepherd girl whose banner had guided him through doubt and despair, but her presence soon began to feel like a burden rather than a blessing. Jean believed with unwavering certainty that her mission was not yet complete. To her, the coronation was only a step on the road to the true liberation of France. The English still held vast territories, and Burgundy, bound by uneasy alliances, threatened from within. She urged Charles to act, to press forward before momentum waned. Yet the court, cloaked in velvet and intrigue, moved at a slower rhythm. Caution, negotiation, and self-preservation guided their thoughts more than visions of divine command. Among the courtiers, jealousy and suspicion spread like a silent contagion. Many had fought their whole lives for influence, and now a peasant girl, lifted by visions and victories, commanded the loyalty of soldiers and the attention of the people. Her simplicity exposed their vanity, and her faith unsettled their cynicism. To some, she was a dangerous reminder that power could arise from outside their carefully guarded circles. They began to whisper in corners, weaving doubts into the air that the king himself breathed. The clergy, too, felt the weight of her presence. Jean spoke often of her voices and visions, describing them with a confidence that unsettled churchmen bound by doctrine. If she truly heard heaven, then she occupied a space beyond their authority. If she did not, then she was a deceiver, or worse, an instrument of the devil. The ambiguity of her gift became a weapon turned against her, sharpened by those who feared her influence. Rumors multiplied faster than victories. Tales spread of enchantments, of unnatural stubbornness, of a girl bewitched by spirits. What had once been hailed as divine favor was now reimagined as dangerous sorcery. In villages and markets, her name carried both reverence and suspicion, and in the halls of nobility it began to provoke unease. The tide of admiration that had lifted her was shifting, replaced by a current of hostility that threatened to drag her down. Jean herself remained blind to the turning of the tide. She still rose each day with the same certainty, guided by the voices that had carried her from Domremy to the throne of France. To her, hesitation was unthinkable, compromise a betrayal. She lived in the urgency of her mission, unable or unwilling to see that her companions were slipping away, their loyalty eroded by envy, fear, and politics. Where she saw allies, shadows gathered. Where she saw divine purpose, others plotted her downfall. The girl who had once been celebrated as the savior of France was now regarded as an inconvenience, a reminder of debts that the crown preferred to forget. In the corridors of power, where soft words carried sharper edges than swords, her fate was already being shaped. Those who had once cheered her name now prepared the stage upon which she would be judged, not as a heroine, but as a threat. The spring of 1430 marked the unraveling of Jean's destiny. At Compiègne, where the French sought to defend the town against the Burgundians, she was taken prisoner in the chaos of battle. Her capture was not a moment of glory, but of treachery, a sudden collapse of the fragile protections that had surrounded her. Those who had marched beside her could not save her, and the enemy, recognizing the value of their prize, quickly delivered her into English hands. What had once been hailed as a miracle became an opportunity for vengeance. The English, determined to break her legend, sought not only her body but her reputation. To kill her as a soldier would have been too simple. They needed to unmake her as a symbol. Her trial in Rouen became less a search for truth than a carefully staged performance, directed by men who feared what her survival represented. She was placed in a dark cell, watched night and day, denied comfort or counsel, and reminded constantly of her isolation. The interrogation stretched across weeks, sometimes hours long, carried out by clerics who questioned her visions, her attire, and her faith. They twisted her words, extracting fragments that could be reshaped into charges of heresy and witchcraft. Each time she insisted on the purity of her mission, her defiance was recorded not as courage, but as rebellion. The court, cloaked in the authority of the church, sought to reduce her voice to silence, stripping her experiences of their sanctity and branding them with suspicion. Promises of mercy were dangled before her, thin veils over demands for submission. If she admitted her guilt, if she renounced the voices, she might yet live. The offer was repeated with quiet persistence, each time meant to break her resolve. Yet Jean resisted, her belief holding firm even as her body weakened under the strain of confinement. The pressure of solitude, humiliation, and endless questioning did not shatter her, though it wore heavily upon her spirit. As the trial advanced, her image in the eyes of the judges hardened into the shape they had chosen for her. She was no longer the Maiden of Orleans, but a dangerous heretic who threatened the order of both crown and church. Her refusal to conform, her insistence on wearing men's clothing, her unwavering testimony about the voices all became tools used against her. The verdict had been decided long before the proceedings began. The rituals of questioning and deliberation served only to clothe the sentence in the appearance of justice. At last, the judgment was pronounced. Jean was condemned, her faith transformed into blasphemy, her courage into disobedience. The sentence was death by fire, the most public and humiliating of punishments, chosen not only to destroy her, but to warn others who might dare to believe as she had. The court that claimed to defend truth instead silenced it with flame. For those in power, her execution would be a demonstration, proof that no figure, however inspired, could stand above the institutions of church and crown. What had begun as a divine mission in the fields of Domremy ended in the cold stone chambers of Rouen, where betrayal and fear reshaped a heroine into a heretic. The stake awaited her, and with it the final attempt to erase her from the world she had tried to save.
The dawn broke cold over Rouen, pale light seeping through the bars of the prison cell where Jean had spent her final night. She knew the day would not reach its evening for her. The footsteps of guards echoed in the corridor, their presence a reminder that the hour had come. Chains clinked as they led her from the shadows of confinement into the brightness of morning. Her body was weary from months of trial and captivity, but her gaze remained unbroken, fixed not on her captors but on something beyond their reach. Through the narrow streets of the city, the procession advanced slowly. Crowds gathered on either side, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Some wept openly, mourning the fate of the girl who had once lifted a nation's hopes. Others jeered, eager to see her fall, their scorn mingling with fear of the power she seemed still to carry. The air trembled with murmurs, prayers, and curses. To many, this was not merely an execution, but a reckoning between heaven and earth. The marketplace, broad and open, had been transformed into a stage of death. In its center stood the pyre, a towering structure of wood and straw, already soaked with pitch to feed the flames. Soldiers ringed the square, their armor gleaming beneath the sun, their faces stern with duty. Priests hovered nearby, their words meant to strip away her defiance, yet her silence rendered them powerless. The smell of smoke lingered even before the fire had been lit, as though the city itself anticipated what was about to unfold.
Jeanne was bound to the stake, her figure framed against the rising sky. The ropes bit into her wrists and waist, pressing her still against the rough timber. Above her head fluttered the executioner's banner, declaring her crime to be heresy. Yet to those who watched, she appeared less a criminal than a sacrifice. The crowd's voices swelled as the executioner lowered the torch, and soon the crackling of fire joined the clamor of human breath. The flames climbed quickly, greedy and unrelenting. Smoke coiled upward, veiling the figure in shifting shadows. The fire licked her body, devouring cloth and flesh, but her voice rose above the roar. It carried across the square, clear and unwavering, a sound that silenced mockery and pierced the hearts of those who had doubted. Her cries were not of surrender, but of faith, each word lifting higher than the smoke that clouded the heavens. Even as the fire consumed her, she remained a presence that could not be subdued. When the flames finally claimed her, the square erupted in uneasy silence. The soldiers turned away, the priests muttered their final prayers, and the crowd dispersed in fragments of grief, awe, and dread. The ashes that remained were scattered to the wind, but they did not erase her. Instead, they became seeds of memory, carried beyond Rouen, beyond France, into the chronicles of history. The English had sought to destroy her name by fire, to reduce her to dust and ridicule. Yet in death she was transfigured, no longer merely a maiden of war, but a symbol of unyielding faith. Time did not dim her presence, it magnified it. France rose again, reshaped by victories that followed, but Jeanne endured beyond battles and crowns. Her body perished in the market square, consumed in smoke and flame, but her spirit became eternal. In songs, in prayers, in the silent resolve of those who came after, her image lived on. What the fire had touched, it had also sanctified. Jeanne d'Arc remained not only a heroine of her nation, but a flame of belief that crossed centuries, a light that defied death itself.